What if I told you that your Spring Boot application can not only connect to one single database, it can also connect to two different completely databases. You can manage them both effortlessly. Whether you are pulling your legacy systems or you are integrating the microservices, today I will show you exactly how do you do that using this Spring Data JPA. In this video, we will walk you through a step-by-step approach to connect to your application with two different databases, that too with two separate repositories, and it can keep your code base very crystal clear. So let's dive right into it. So the very first thing, you all have to start creating the project. So you'll have to create the basic Spring Boot setup with the right dependencies has to be added up. So first, in the dependencies section, you have to choose the Spring Web. Once you add that Spring Web, you can add the Spring Data JPA dependency. Once you add the Spring Data JPA, you have to add the S2 database. So this can be the database one for your application. It might be any other databases. Just for example, I'm trying to take S2, and also you can choose MySQL or PostgreSQL of your choice. Now you can swap this out dependencies or what database you are using, but we will use your S2 and MySQL for the demo purpose. Let us look at the project architecture. So the structure is in the SRC. If you go there and open that, you will see there is Java. Under that there is a folder. Now you will see there is two separate folders which we have to create. One is db1 and db2. So this will be already there for your separate databases, and you have your main application. Over here you will see there are application.yml or properties. Then you will see you will have you have to define the configuration. So Spring Boot is going to auto configure one data source by default, but when you have two, right, when you need two of them, you have to explicitly tell the Spring how you want to handle each of them. Okay, so for that reason we have to create the configuration file for each particular database, whether you are using MySQL, whether using Oracle, whether you are using S2, Postgre, database of your choice, but the configuration has to be different. Okay, so this will be applicable for n number of databases as well. So if you can configure two of them, you can configure n of them, right? So you can follow similar setup. Now in the first configuration file, let's say you are using it for the db1. Okay, so you have to define the @configuration. So this has to be picked up as a configuration. So you have to annotate with @configuration. Then you have to enable the transaction management in this particular database. So for that you have to add the @enable transaction management. Post that, you will see that you have to add the enable repo repository. So this will scan your package. Okay, so wherever your classes are related to that particular package, that is going to be the configuration one, you have to keep that. So here you see there is db1. Now under that you will have to define the entity manager, factory, and then also the which type of transaction manager over here. Now in the under this you will see we'll have the configuration. So you have to define the configuration properties. Let's say which database properties you have to load it from the properties. So you will have to take that from that particular data source and then assign it to the data source properties. So this will be assigned over there. Second, you have to define the data source properties. You have to initialize that particular thing with that data source. So first we have taken the properties and then we have taken the source. Now we have to define the entity manager factory bean over here. So here you are trying to pass on the factory builder over here, and then you are trying to build that factory with the help of the data source, the package, whatever your the model entity, whatever is going to be relevant to that particular database, and then we'll make use of the persistent unit, that is db1. So and then we are going to build it over there. Post, what we are going to do is that lastly we are going to take the platform manage transaction manager. Now this will take the factory as an input, whatever we have done. Now this is going to call the JPA transaction manager over here. So that's all for the configuration part. Similar configuration we have to do it for the database configuration too. So where you have to define the configuration, transaction management, the repositories to scan, okay, all those particular data source related, data source property related, entity manager related, platform transaction manager, you have to define those. Okay, so notice how we are using @primary on the first data source to make it very default. Okay, so if you open that particular primary data source, that is the config1, you will see that each configuration is going to handle its own entities, its own repository, its own transaction manager. So that will be primarily be loaded over there. Then we'll go to the application.yml. Okay, you will see there are different configurations. So whenever you are defining the data source, you have to define the Spring data source db1. So we are taking up the only data source related to the Spring data source 1. So here you are defining the URL of that particular, then the data driver, then the username and password. So all this configuration you have to define those. Then we have to define like certain properties like hibernate DDL auto, which is going to update your database schema whenever you are trying to create. Okay, then show SQL, it is going to show whatever the backend queries are being fired up, whether it is insert, loading, something else. Actually it will show this all this. So here we are defining the properties for both database 1 and database 2. So make sure these keys are matching the one which are used in your configuration classes. Then we'll define the entities and the repositories. So here in, let's define an entity package, and under that you have to define your, let's say in database 1 you are using user over there, so define the entity class over there. Then you have to write all the required attributes. So you can define some primary key like ID, you can define some name over there, so you can provide the getter setters, or we can make use of the lombok. So you have to make sure you annotate with @entity over there. So once you annotate with @entity, it is going to scan up and identify that this particular is a model class and it has to be mapped up to the database table. Second, once you have this particular entity defined, then you have to define the repository layer. So you have to define those repository. So there is a JPA repository interface which you have to extend, and then you have to have that particular define that it is of which particular entity you are trying to refer and get the data from. So here you define the user and then the primary key over here. Secondly, the same configuration, the same details has to be applied for a different entity in a different database. So here in the database 2, we are going to make use of the product over here. So product is an entity. We are defining @entity over there. We are defining some primary key and value. So here we have defined the ID, the name, the price, and the getter setters of those particular product table entity. Then we have defined the interface, the repository layer. So here I have defined the product over here. Now notice that the entities and the repositories are very separated per databases. So this is very crucial to avoid the Spring scanning issues which are there when you are trying to load your system or make your application up. Then at the application, the main application, if you are aware that @Spring Boot application has to be annotated, and then we have to write the run method over there where your application will run. Now we'll try to tweak this. We'll try to implement the command liner interface over here, and then what we are going to do is that we are going to run that at the start of the application. So here we are trying to make use of the @repository, and then we are making using the that is the product repository. So user repository and the product repository, we are trying to make use of it. Now there is a main method over here which we have started the application. Now after the run method has started up, internally this particular thing will be, as we are implementing the command liner, there will be an implementation we have written here as a run method, where this particular method will be run up, And here you see I'm calling the repository and trying to save a user with the name, and then I'm trying to save the product with product details like laptop or some username related details. Okay, so if I am adding those, you are getting the details over there. Similarly, I'm trying to get the data from the database. So there are user repositories, find all, and find all for all this product and the user story. So whenever your application is starting, Spring Boot will connect to this particular do database. It will manage its entity as a set of a different entity, and simply this is going to be a very clean and powerful way to connect to the database. Now, as a bonus step, you can use two combinations of databases, like you can use S2 plus MySQL, you can use Postgre plus Oracle. So any combination of database you can use. So when you are trying to consider naming your transaction managers, your persistent unit very clearly, so that will avoid any confusion. Also, always avoid the entity package overlap between the two data sources. So make sure you follow this particular tips over here. Now, and after this, like, I think that's all from this particular video. You are now connected to the Spring Boot application to two different databases and using the Spring Data JPA. So it is going to keep it very clean and maintainable. So if this video has been very helpful to you, hit the like button. Also subscribe for more such Spring Boot tutorials, Java, Spring Boot, microservices. Also, there are ton of interview related series which I have uploaded. Please watch out. Also, let me know in your comment section which tech stack or you want me to cover in the next video. Till then, thank you.